After my grandfather passed away, my grandmother's world turned upside down. She had been married to him for over 60 years, a lifetime spent together in the old house they had shared since they were newlyweds. The house, built by my great-grandfather, was a sprawling, two-story structure with creaky wooden floors, narrow hallways, and a basement that always seemed to retain a damp, earthy smell, no matter how many times it was aired out. My grandparents had filled that house with love, raising their children, hosting family gatherings, and filling the rooms with the sounds of laughter, music, and the aroma of my grandmother's famous cooking. The house was their haven, a place that had seen so much life. But after Grandpa died, the life seemed to drain out of it, leaving behind only shadows and echoes of what once was. At first, the changes were subtle. My grandmother became quieter, more withdrawn. It was understandable. Losing a spouse after so many years is a heavy blow, and we all assumed she just needed time to grieve. She stopped going out as much, declining invitations to family gatherings and preferring to stay home. When we visited, we noticed she had begun keeping the curtains drawn, even during the day, which was unlike her. She used to love letting in the sunlight, especially in the mornings when she would sit by the window with her tea, watching the birds in the garden. But the house, once filled with warmth and light, started to feel different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that settled over anyone who stepped inside. The rooms felt colder, the shadows darker. My grandmother's behavior became increasingly concerning. She began talking about hearing noises at night, footsteps in the hallway, the sound of someone moving around downstairs. We all tried to reassure her, suggesting it was just the house settling or perhaps her mind playing tricks on her in her grief. However, she insisted that it was more than that. She started saying that she could feel my grandfather's presence, that he hadn't really left. She would sit in his old armchair, staring at the spot where he used to sit, and talk to him as if he were still there. At first, we thought it was just her way of coping, holding on to his memory in a way that made her feel less alone. But there was something unsettling about the way she spoke, as if she truly believed he was there, in the room with her. My mother became worried and suggested that we visit more often, to keep my grandmother company and to make sure she wasn't too isolated. I started spending weekends there, hoping to lift her spirits. But the more time I spent in that house, the more I felt that something wasn't right. The air was thick with an oppressive feeling, and I found myself avoiding certain parts of the house, especially the basement. There was nothing specific I could point to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was something lurking just out of sight. One evening, as I was helping my grandmother prepare dinner, I noticed she seemed particularly agitated. Her hands trembled as she chopped vegetables, and she kept glancing over her shoulder. When I asked her what was wrong, she hesitated before saying, "He's angry." I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't elaborate. She just shook her head and muttered something under her breath, something I couldn't quite catch. That night, I slept in the guest room, a small room at the end of the hallway upstairs. I had always found it cozy, with its sloped ceiling and a view of the garden. But that night, it felt different. The shadows seemed to stretch further, and the silence was deafening. I had just started to drift off to sleep when I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably heavy, like the steps of a man. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, listening as the footsteps came closer to my door. They stopped just outside, and I held my breath, waiting. I was too terrified to move, too scared to even turn on the light. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. The next morning, I mentioned the footsteps to my grandmother, but she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she nodded and said, "He's upset. He's not at peace." When I pressed her for more details, she finally opened up. She told me that she believed my grandfather's spirit was still in the house, but that he wasn't the same man she had known in life. In death, he had become something darker, filled with anger and resentment. She said it started with little things, cold spots in the house, objects moving on their own, doors creaking open in the middle of the night. But then it escalated. She began to see him, not as a comforting presence, but as a looming figure in the shadows, watching her with cold, accusing eyes. She said he would stand at the foot of her bed at night, staring at her, and she could feel his anger, his disappointment. She didn't know why he was so upset, but she was convinced that he was trying to tell her something she couldn't understand. We decided to bring in a grief counselor, hoping it would help her process her feelings and perhaps ease the tension in the house. But after a few sessions, the counselor called my mother and expressed concerns. She said my grandmother seemed to be fixated on the idea that my grandfather was punishing her for something. She wouldn't say what, only that she felt she had done something to upset him deeply. Around this time, the incidents in the house became more frequent and more disturbing. The lights would flicker on and off, even after we had the wiring checked multiple times. The temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, so much that you could see your breath, even on the warmest days. Objects would go missing, only to turn up in strange places, like my grandmother's wedding ring, which she found in the basement after it had disappeared from her jewelry box. One afternoon, I was sitting with my grandmother in the living room when we heard a loud crash from the kitchen. We rushed in to find one of her favorite dishes shattered on the floor. It had been sitting on the counter, far from the edge, and there was no way it could have fallen on its own. My grandmother stood there, staring at the broken pieces, and whispered, "He's trying to tell me something." I tried to convince her to leave the house, to come stay with us for a while, but she refused. She said she couldn't leave him, that she had to figure out what he wanted. My mother and I didn't know what to do. We were worried about her mental health, but every time we suggested getting help, she would shut down and refuse to talk about it. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was staying over again, and around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something crashing downstairs. It was loud, like furniture being overturned. I jumped out of bed and ran down the hall to my grandmother's room, only to find her sitting up in bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She was clutching the locket my grandfather had given her on their wedding day, the one she never took off. She looked at me and said, "He's here. He's in the house." I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a bad dream, but she shook her head vehemently. "No," she insisted, "he's angry. He's not at rest." Before I could respond, we heard another crash, this time from the living room. We both froze, listening as the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. They were heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably human. My grandmother gripped my hand tightly, her eyes pleading with me to understand what she had been trying to tell us all along. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get out of that house and never come back, but I couldn't leave her there alone. So we sat there, in the dark, listening as the footsteps grew closer, until they were right outside the bedroom door. My grandmother was shaking, tears streaming down her face. She whispered, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear my grandmother's ragged breathing, feel her trembling beside me. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, until finally, the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains. The next morning, my grandmother agreed to leave the house. She packed a small bag and came to stay with us. She was quiet, withdrawn, and it was clear that the events of the previous night had taken a toll on her. She never spoke of what happened, and we didn't press her. We knew better than to bring it up. We put the house on the market, and it sold quickly. No one in the family wanted it, and we were relieved to see it go. My grandmother lived with us for a few more years, but she was never the same. She remained quiet, always looking over her shoulder as if expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. She passed away quietly in her sleep, and I hope that in death, she finally found the peace that eluded her in those last years. After she died, we went back to the house one last time, to collect a few remaining things before the new owners moved in. The house was empty, stripped of all its belongings, but it still felt heavy, oppressive. As I stood in the living room, I could almost hear the echoes of those footsteps, feel the coldness that had settled over the place. I tried to rationalize everything that had happened, to convince myself that it was just a combination of grief and an old, creaky house playing tricks on us. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something darker that we couldn't understand. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows stretch long across the floor, I can still hear the sound of those footsteps in my mind, and I wonder if my grandfather ever truly left that house, or if some part of him is still there, waiting. The new owners never reported anything strange, but we never spoke to them after the sale. I sometimes wonder if the house's new life has erased whatever haunted my grandmother in those final years, or if the darkness still lingers there, waiting for someone else to notice, someone else to disturb whatever uneasy peace was left behind.